And now, please welcome charter school founder, author, and education advocate Ian Rowe to the stage.
Hey, everybody. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Everyone here? Yeah, great.
All right, what a great setup for our last and final conversation. That was a picture of kids in charter schools all around Mississippi. So it's my pleasure to introduce my friend Ian Rowe. He is Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education and upward mobility, family formation, and adoption. He is the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, which is a new network of charter high schools in the Bronx. He spent 10 years as CEO of another charter school network. He spent time at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He even did a stint at MTV.
I did.
I bet you couldn't have, that was not on your bingo card.
Yeah.
He's a Teach for America alum. I know we have some other Teach for America folks here. And he's a first-generation American. His parents immigrated from Jamaica.
Yes.
And he's an author. His recent book, Agency, is fantastic. And I'm delighted to have you here. And I thought, what a great way to start it. What is Agency, and why did you write the book?
Wow, well, thank you, Grant, and thank you for this opportunity to be here. I've been listening to some of the conversations, and it is impressive. You know, it's sometimes tough for a state that may often be maligned, and then really put your nose to the grindstone and say we can make change, and you have a deliberate effort, and then celebrate when it happens, while still recognizing that there is work to be done. So I think that's pretty powerful and worthy of a sort of a self-congratulatory moment. And so in some ways, when you ask what is agency, in a sense, what I just described, this sort of process of self-renewal, self-betterment, strengthening who you are, that's in some ways what we're trying to cultivate within our own students and my own children, frankly, the sense of agency, the sense that you can lead a self-determined life of purpose and meaning, a life of personal responsibility. I run schools in the Bronx, and I've run schools, for close to 15 years now in the Bronx, Lower East Side of Manhattan, primarily low-income kids, Black and Hispanic kids, who face many of the same challenges that children here face in Mississippi. And the things that I've realized, the reason I run schools is I want our students to know that they can do hard things, that they will face inevitable challenges, but they have the capacity within to overcome those challenges, that they don't have to adopt a victimhood narrative. And part of the reason I wrote the book is that over the last few years, especially since, particularly the deaths of Michael Brown, George Floyd, there have been these emerging narratives that, in a sense, have robbed young people of a sense of agency, that have robbed their ability to see a sense of possibility within their own lives. And I describe these, what I call meta-narratives, as blame the system and blame the victim. In a blame the system narrative or ideology, that's a view of the United States that if you're not successful in this country, you are, it's because America itself is inherently an oppressive nation, that the systems themselves are imbued with racism, or if you're of a certain skin color, if you're a certain gender, if you're a certain economic class, the systems are rigged against you. Capitalism is evil. There's a white supremacist lurking on every corner, and that these systems are so powerful, so dominant, so rigged that you as an individual are powerless to overcome them. And the only ways to survive is if there's some massive government intervention that will somehow save the day. And obviously in that kind of blame the system narrative, that obviously robs you a sense of your own sense of self-determination, right? But on the other side, I've observed particularly over the last few years, also this kind of blame the victim narrative, that if you're not successful in this country, it's not because America is the problem. I mean, America's great. You know, America is the land of opportunity. The streets are paved with gold. So if you're not successful, it's your fault, right? You somehow are the architect of your own failure. You didn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And so between these two narratives, you know, blame the victim, blame the system, it's pretty hard for you to craft a sense of your own future. I mean, you know, we just opened up Vertex Partnership Academies, a high school in the Bronx. Only 7% of kids that start ninth grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college, right? Meaning that you start ninth grade and you either drop out or you actually do earn your high school diploma 4 years from then, but you still can't do math nor reading without remediation. But in this district, there's a cap on charter schools. So all those great schools you just saw in that video, you would be prohibited if you had a great idea to launch a school to serve these kids. You couldn't do that, right? So that's an example of a true systemic barrier. So when you, even in a blame the victim ideology, a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old can't solve that problem. But so the idea is that we have to find an empowering alternative between blame the system and blame the victim, and that's really why I wrote the book, Agency, because I wanted to create a new way of looking at the problem, not being so obsessed with failure, because we often spend so much time on the parts of our system where kids are failing. In almost every system, almost any neighborhood where you see lots of failure, there is almost always success. Always. And yet somehow we just ignore what are the ingredients that it's enabling and empowering people to thrive, even in the very conditions that so many seem to be failing. And that's what Agency is all about. It really tries to dig into what are the ingredients that make it so, particularly for young people, that if they choose this pathway, they're much more likely to succeed.
So you use a phrase in the book you have a whole chapter on this, where you speak to saying, we're not saying racism and barriers don't exist, but you use the phrase surmountable racism.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, if you normally listen to these kinds of debates on, why there's lack of mobility in certain communities and why it's existed for so long, and particularly around the issue of race, there's usually what I call monocausality. That if, like for example, in education, there's been a racial achievement gap for as long as there's been a national assessment for educational progress, the nation's report card. And it's true, if you look at the reading levels at 4th, 8th, and 12th grade for white students, let's say it's here, and for black students, it's here, right? And so that gap has been relatively static for 30, 40 years. And so some people look at that and say, mic drop, that's the proof of systemic discrimination, systemic bias, systemic racism. Well, it turns out that if you look at that same data, there has never been a year in which a majority of white students are even reading at grade level, right? So even if we were to close what is often the goal, to close the racial achievement gap, all you would be achieving is universal mediocrity, right? Perhaps there are factors outside of race that are really driving some of these outcomes. But when you're often in these conversations, the idea is that, no, this is structural racism. This is institutional racism. This is systemic racism. And my thing is, look, well, okay, if you're going to insist on those, then you also have to insist on this idea of surmountable racism. That there's never been a human society in which people don't find some reason to discriminate against another group of people, whether it's on race, religion. It's unfortunately part of the human condition. The question is, what do we do? What do we empower young people to know that they have within their quiver to be successful against the range of adversity that they're going to face? And so so I think it's important to acknowledge we live in the real world where there are forces that can impede the progress of whole groups of people. Again, in the same district in New York, in the Bronx, where the college the college readiness is about 7%. Again, there's a legislative barrier impeding the ability for people to open up schools. Most of the elected officials who were voting to keep that prohibition in place are black. So is that an example of systemic racism when most of the elected officials who were impeding the ability for primarily black and low-income Hispanic kids to get an opportunity, that's who's holding it back? So race obviously takes up a certain place, but it almost like sucks the energy out of almost any other forces that we need to have the courage and honesty to face. And again, that's why I've written Agency, to show that there's a different kind of framework that we can think about that doesn't ignore these factors, but maybe can empower young people to think differently about their lives.
So you mentioned this framework. This is FREE. What does it stand for? What does it mean?
Well, family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship, free. And when I started writing this book, I actually had no concept of this framework. I was thinking about upward mobility, but the thing is, I really started to challenge myself to think about, you talk a little bit about my career, and I've had some amazing experiences from the White House, MTV, Bill and Melinda Gates, Teach for America, now running schools for the last 15 years. And in that time, I have worked with so many different kinds of kids. Black kids, white kids, Asian kids, Hispanic kids, poor kids, rich kids, kids in homeless shelters, kids who's faced unbelievable abuse and neglect. And so I've been in this work long enough now that I've seen kids who, as they start to make their decisions, as they enter young adulthood, where they basically are recreating the same disadvantages that they may have experienced growing up, right? So they've perpetuated this cycle of deprivation in their own lives, right? But I've also seen kids who were raised in the kinds of conditions that most people looking from the outside would say, oh my God, that kid is doomed for failure. They single parent home, low income, dad incarcerated, and yet somehow as they make their decisions into young adulthood, they break the cycle, right? They're on a different pathway. And so the animating question of my life has become, what makes the difference? Is it just random? Is it that, the ones who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage were just, they were born 7 foot tall with a basketball in their hand and they could just make it? And my observation is that it's not random, that the young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage as they entered young adulthood, in my view, in my experience, usually had a sense of personal agency, of personal responsibility, that they had the sense that they could lead a self-determined life. But it didn't come from nowhere, right? I say agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered. And the social empowerment, in my observation, came from 4 institutions: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. I'll go through each one very quickly. In family, and because it's the anchor, the acronym is FREE, not EARF, right? like F is first. Because the young people that were able to break the cycle of disadvantage, the thing that they seemed to recognize was that the most fundamental human decision, a decision a human being can make, is to bring another human being into the world, right? And that there are different strategies. And so they recognized, regardless of the family that they were from, the key was about the family that they were on the pathway to form. So that's why in our schools, at Vertex Partnership Academies, we actually have a class called Pathways to Power. And in that class, we teach the data associated with something called the success sequence, which some of you might be familiar with. Even if you're not familiar with the term, probably many of you have followed it in your life. But but it's data that says if a young person finishes just their high school degree, then gets a full-time job of any kind, just so they learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if they have children, marriage first, so that order, education, work, marriage, then children. Data says 97% of millennials who follow that path of decision-making avoid poverty, and the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. We think that's really important information for young people to know, especially, again, in the district in which I run in the Bronx, the non-marital birth rate is 84%, right? And you could, you know, that number, you go to Chicago, LA, Appalachia, you know, there are non-marital birth rates of that order of magnitude. So if young people are not seeing examples of what it means to form a family, we as the school have to take the step to teach that. And what's interesting, we teach it not in what I call a prescriptive fashion, meaning you must do this. We teach it in a descriptive fashion, meaning that you're going to be making a lot of decisions over the course of the next 10 years of your life around relationships, education, but you should know there's one set of pathways that typically leads to 97% avoidance of poverty and entry into the middle class or beyond. There are other pathways that lead to different sets of outcomes, but you ultimately have to decide. So that's among the ways we talk about how we help young people understand the pathways for that first F in free family. Our religion, again, over my course of time, seeing young people who broke the cycle of disadvantage, usually they lived by a moral code, typically informed by some kind of organized religion. Didn't matter, it almost doesn't matter what religion, but that there was a set of precepts that they said there was a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And importantly, they were part of a community of people, whether it be going to church on Sunday, but they were part of a community of people that held them accountable to living up to that moral code. And you know, even as we see religiosity going down in our country, you know, high levels of loneliness, isolation, alienation, the numbers are dramatically different for young people who have a personal faith commitment in their own lives. And that's what I observed. So that's the R in free. E, not surprisingly, stands for educational freedom, school choice, many of the things we've talked about here, that young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage typically benefited from the ability to go to a school that their caregivers thought was right for them. And unfortunately, too many kids across the country don't have access to that. But if you're on this pathway where you're on the pathway to form a strong family, you have a personal faith commitment, you've benefited from educational freedom, that usually adds up to the last E, entrepreneurship, where you have what I call an entrepreneurial mindset. You're a problem solver in your own life. Like, so when the inevitable challenges come, you have the ability to craft a plan to overcome. And so that's my framework, free, family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship, as my empowering alternative to the blame the system and blame the victim narratives. And what I try to do in the book, at least, is to show the pathways for which we can help young people embrace each of these pillars within their own lives.
So in a lot of ways, I mean, these are such common sense ideas.
Yes.
And yet, I follow you on Twitter, so I see the kind of abuse and the attacks you get, that people think some of this stuff is really radical.
Yeah.
And what's astonishing to me is how many people of all political stripes who are successful in America follow the success sequence. They follow the free framework. And you say it in the book. You say, we've got to get back to preaching what we practice. Mm-hmm. And 50 or even 100 years or 50 years ago, people did that. And now we're afraid to say, there's a lot of data to support this path. Yep. Why are we so afraid to say this?
Yeah, well, this is, I named my book Agency, but in many ways the most important word to walk away from is one of the cardinal virtues that we teach at our school. It's courage. It's having the courage just to say obvious things. There's a great book that is about to come out called The Two-Parent Privilege by Melissa Kearney, who's an economist. And in this book, she writes about just the overwhelming data that shows that children raised in married two-parent households massively different and more positive outcomes relative to any other family formation. But throughout the book, God, she apologizes almost so many times for saying, I'm not saying we're not demonizing single mothers, and which, by the way, we're not, right? But this kind of highlighting the ideal or highlighting what is almost obviously better for kids somehow now is construed as an attack on any other family structure, I think is what makes people start to say, wait a minute, if I go out there and say this, I'm going to be called racist, I'm going to be doing blaming the victim, right? So the blame the victim narrative. And so if you talk about these kinds of things, because I'm accused of being a blamer of the victims often by simply naming some of the cultural issues that face many of the communities that seem to be entrenched in these sort of cycle of deprivation. And the thing that if you are genuinely concerned with the upward mobility of kids in Mississippi or anywhere else across the country, the one word I want you to walk away from this is have the courage to say what you know to be true, especially if you've done it in your own life. You know, when we first started teaching the success sequence in schools in New York City, I had huge pushback. You can't do that. You can't teach these things. You're imposing middle-class values onto these kids. You know, I'm like, well, yeah, I am trying to impose middle class. Yes, we have eons and eons of humanity that have, but no, because, you know, you'll be embarrassing these kids, you'll be shaming these kids. And I remember when we were designing Vertex Partnership Academies, our high school in the Bronx, this was right before COVID. I was visiting high-performing high schools across the country. So I was in New Orleans, and I visited a KIPP high school. And so it was a 9th grade class, predominantly Black and Hispanic and Asian students, all low income. And the teacher gave me permission to talk to the class. And I decided to use it as kind of a mini focus group. And I said to this class, if you knew that there were a series of decisions in your control, that when young people just like you followed that series of decisions, 97% of the time, those young people avoided poverty later in life and entered the middle class and had a lot more economic freedom. Would you want to know what those series of decisions are? And these very reasonable, logical 9th graders said, well, yeah, of course I'd want. Why wouldn't I want to know? And then I said, well, there's some grown-ups that don't want you to know. That's, by the way, that's from my experience at MTV. The one thing you want to get young people, dangle it and then take it away. Right. So I said, there's some grown-ups that don't want you to know. You can't handle it. You might get insulted. You might be offended. So better just not to tell you, right? And so they looked at me like I was crazy. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? You tell us. You let us decide after we know the information whether or not we think it's useful or not. Very interesting, right? Because there's always gatekeepers who somehow what's good for them evidently is not good for these people who they're trying to help, but they can't follow my way of life, right? Mm-hmm. Those are the gatekeepers that you have to have the courage to stand up to. So we then proceeded to have a conversation where I talked to these young people about this thing called the success sequence. Not a guarantee, 97%, but there are other pathways. And what was interesting about the conversation at the end of it, it's not as if at the end these 9th graders like, oh, my life is solved. But what I definitely felt was that they felt that they had been respected as future decision makers within their own life, right? That's what we're trying to do with solid, healthy education. Ensure young people have the information to make the best decisions for themselves. So while there are all these other people attacking, you can't teach this, you can't do this, blah, 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 the people themselves, The very people who are in the situation that we're all trying to help are yearning for the tools that would allow them to overcome the barriers that everyone else is telling them are insurmountable. That's why I talk about surmountable racism. What are the tools that we need to give and empower young people with so they can overcome this victimhood narrative?
And the racism that actually exists.
No, of course, again, but there is no society.
Right.
You know, I just read some data. Okay, so here's another example. So the racial wealth gap is often used as proof of historical and present-day racial discrimination in this country. And if you look at the 2019 survey of consumer finances, it is true that the median wealth of the average white family is about it's about $180,000 more than the median wealth. Oh no, it's not 160,000. It's about $160,000 more than the median wealth of the average black family. Again, mic drop, end of conversation. That's systemic racism, done, right? Okay, well, but if you look at that same 2019 survey of consumer finances, if you take into account just two factors, family structure and education, it turns out that the median wealth of the average married, college-educated black family is about $160,000 more than the median wealth of the average white single-parent family. So why is that important to know, for young people in particular to know? Well, maybe there are factors beyond race that are far more determinative in what your life can be. Doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist or any host of other challenges, but clearly there are people that are being successful who have recognized that there are other tools within their quiver. And so it's just trying to widen the aperture, right? To let young people know that they don't have to live in this narrow sort of sleeve of life where everyone else is telling you what you have the capacity to do or not based on this singular characteristic.
Yeah, I love where you say in the book, we're trying to give our kids tools to overcome, or tools to act on things they can control and not just suffer by things they can't control.
Correct, right. I mean, that's why the blame the system narrative is so debilitating, right? Because, who's it? Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of the 1619 Project, she literally says in this essay where she's arguing for, like a $13-14 trillion government reparations program, which just give money to black people. She says, it doesn't matter what a black person does. Doesn't matter if you save, doesn't matter if you buy a home, doesn't matter if you get educated in college, doesn't matter if you get married. In her words, none of those things can overcome 400 years of racialized plundering. It's really, God, I mean, then what do I do? How do I make it in this world? And so if young people over and over and over and over and over are being told how systemically biased this entire society is against them, after a while you start to believe it, and you start to not believe in any of the institutions that actually could empower you to rise above whatever discrimination. Yeah. And by the way, this isn't only for black kids. The non-marital birth rate, in the black community in the mid-1960s, which is when Pat Moynihan wrote his famous report about, because at the time, he saw that there was a segment of the black community that was not doing well. And he decided to write this report about it. And he did this analysis, and he came to the conclusion that the non-marital birth rate in the black community was a real issue. It was 23.6% when he wrote that report in 1964. Crisis, 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 right? Well, the non-marital birth rate in the black community today is 70%, but it's 30% in the white community, at a higher rate than the crisis levels were in the black community in the 60s. So it's what I call the equal opportunity tsunami. So these issues, and one of the things I think we have to get better at is de-racializing some of these issues. So you don't only think, well, this is just an issue of these poor black kids. You know, look, there's a reason deaths of despair, a lot of the research you've read recently about the white working class, a lot of that has to do with the same issues of breakdown of family structure, explosion in non-marital birth rates, lower religiosity, lack of access to high quality education. These are factors that affect humanity. And so again, that's something I try to do in the book, which is to de-race. Because sometimes race is so heavy, it impedes our ability to recognize that these are issues, as well as these are levers that could unleash Mississippi or unleash people of all backgrounds to really fulfill their potential.
So how does this play itself out practically in your schools? I mean, you talk in the book about ESAs, you talk about other forms of school choice, but you've spent now 15 years opening and running charter schools.
Yeah.
How does this philosophy and the topics you talk about in the book, how does it play itself out in the students that you're leading?
Well, it's a good question because I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which is an amazing organization, some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, doing research and forming policy, which is extremely important. And there's nothing like actually running schools in neighborhoods with real people, because you just get a whole different perspective on how to actually make these things happen. So I mentioned, in District 12 in the Bronx, where we just opened up Vertex Partnership Academies, our high school, we were sued by the teachers union and when we put this idea forth. Again, in a district where only 7% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, and the union literally sued to block us before we opened. Thankfully, a New York State Supreme Court judge threw out the case 6 days before school was going to open in August of 2022. Like, you just don't learn that by crafting policy papers and doing research. And so this idea of theory and practice is very, very important to me to really get at the heart of your question of how do you really bring this to life. And so in our school, there's several things that we try to do, one of which is teaching the success sequence, like teaching real data about the pathway of decisions that young people are going to be making within the next 10 years of their lives. We also have a great focus around how to cultivate agency and personal responsibility. So the entire school is organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And they're the cardinal virtues, like cardinal is cardo, the Latin root for hinge, right? Because all other standards of moral excellence are built off of the 4 cardinal virtues. And so we have our students internalize through these I statements of what courage, what each one of them means. So courage stands for I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of struggle and uncertainty. Those are words that all of our kids internalize and memorize. Temperance. I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. Our students learn those words, right? And so it's really important that sometimes it's repetition and memorization, and over time they start to realize, wait a minute, I lead my life with self-discipline, and I'm responsible for my learning and behavior. It's really important that young people know that they're responsible. Ultimately, there are lots of systems, there's lots of environmental factors for sure, but at the end of the day, you are responsible for your own life. I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of struggle and uncertainty. It's really important to be able to grab that in moments when you might be feeling like, wow, maybe I don't have any choice here. I just have to do this. But no, I lead my life with self-discipline, right? Because I'm responsible for my learning and behavior. So that's something else that's very, very important. We also do a lot of oral recitation of poetry. There's a great poem that all of our kids know. I mean, yesterday I was taping one of our classes learning Invictus, which is a poem some of you might know by William Ernest Henley. And the last two lines of Invictus are, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." Beautiful, amazing words. And when you see a group of young people, by the way, all in their uniforms and blazers, it's inspiring, right? And it becomes infectious because they're taking control of their lives, or we at least are trying to help them learn how to take control of their lives. Another thing that we do is we recognize, so this is at the high school level, we recognize at college, so when I started running elementary and middle schools, that was the prior network I ran for a decade, I was all about college, 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 right? That's college, college, college. I mean, that's it, right? Well, it turns out college it's not always the right answer for every kid, right? So at the end of sophomore year, every young person will have the choice to choose a pathway which is a more traditional university or college pathway. So during their junior and senior year, they're really being prepped to attend some of the finest colleges and universities in the country. Or they can choose what we call the careers pathway. And in the careers pathway, you can still, at the end of your junior and senior year, you could still go to college if that's who you want. However, we're embedding within that 2 years the opportunity to do apprenticeships. So imagine you could work at Google maybe one day a week, studying coding and being able to get a credential for it. Or at a New York City hospital where you could learn to become a phlebotomist and learning how to take blood. And so at the end of 4 years of high school, you could actually have an industry credential with labor market value. So if you wanted to get a job right out of high school, that could be something that you do. And it doesn't mean that means you never go to college. It might just mean you go to college 2 or 3 years after you've been able to pocket some money, you've had a couple more years of maturity. And there's a ton of data. MDRC did a great study a couple years ago which showed that particularly for low-income boys, their outcomes when they had work immediately out of high school, far lower numbers of non-marital births, far less engagement with the criminal justice system, higher rates of college going and college completion if they did go a few years out. So these are some of the things that we're doing to make these ideas real for how you actually cultivate a sense of agency within our students.
So we love charter schools here. We only have 8. I told you a minute ago, we only have 8 charters. Actually, as of this fall, we have 10 that are now open statewide.
25% increase.
That's right. We're getting there. We need a lot more. But it's interesting when you think about this topic of agency and how important it is in the lives, and it is such an American idea. And yet we designed an education system that assigns kids to schools based on their neighborhood that doesn't give them the ability to exercise agency about the school they go to. So I guess my question would be, we have some lawmakers here. Why is this so important? And why have you decided you care about this agency thing and you've decided to put it into practice in schools?
Yep.
What would you say to lawmakers about what we ought to do to spread it here?
I guess what I'd say is imagine a conversation with a 22-year-old mom who has made some tough decisions in her life. And she has a 4-year-old daughter, and so she's trying to figure out her life, the mom, but she wants to ensure that her daughter has the kinds of opportunities she just didn't have access to, right? And let's say she's in the Bronx or maybe Mississippi, but the school that she's zoned for has had single-digit proficiency rates for as long as she has lived there, and she's lived there 22 years of her life. And there's a Catholic school or another public school or a charter school maybe half a mile away, right? And she sees that school, and maybe she sees the Catholic school, and it's like $2,500 or $5,000, and then she can't afford it. But there's a voucher, or there's an ESA, or there's a tool that would allow her to go from this school, which has single-digit proficiency rates, and there's that school less than half a mile away. Like, that's the conversation I want a legislator to think about. Don't listen to all the, the muckety-mucks, the gatekeepers, the ones who send their own kids to private schools, or the ones who's moved to the suburbs to go to great schools for free. Just put yourself in that conversation with that 22-year-old mom who wants the best for her kid to ensure her kid has a shot that she may not have had. You have to humanize these things in a way to cut through all the rhetoric and nonsense that the gatekeepers are doing to preserve the status quo that only hurts kids.
So I want to close with this question to you. I think your work and your book is so incredibly timely and relevant to this moment in our country. But it really is timeless, and the ideas are timeless. When you think about the book and maybe your broader life work, what do you hope the legacy of all this is 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now?
Oh, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the legacy. Well, de Tocqueville, when he was, a Frenchman who was observing America 200 plus years ago, observing the practices of this strange new country, he saw all these things that people organized, they created associations locally, they didn't wait for they didn't wait for someone else to just come, they came together.
Yep.
And they solved problems locally. They tapped into each other. There's this sense, this kinship, this Americanism, right? We are, and he has this phrase. What makes America special is not that it's more enlightened than any other nation. It's that it has the ability to repair her faults. And I've always thought that was a beautiful symbolic image, because in the same way he views the country, I want every kid to see themselves that way, that within them they have the tools of self-renewal, self-betterment, that they have the tools to repair their own faults, that we can become better. And I want to live in a society where most young people have that sense of agency. You're going to run into challenges, you are. But you have the ability to repair your own internal faults for whatever external forces may be coming your way. And my hope is that this fight actually brings us together as a country across race. We've now gotten to the point where, as I said before, many of these issues are human issues of family structure, issues of loss of religiosity, issues of lack of access to high-quality education. It affects everyone. And so I would hope that our fight is now across a human dimension. And that's the legacy I would love to leave.
That's good. Well, we're going to continue this conversation over reception in a couple minutes. Please help me thank Ian Rowe.
Yeah.